Ashima Goyal, member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Ma'am, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Let me ask you for your thoughts both on the real GDP number but also on the nominal number, ma'am, which is very low for Indian standards.
Right. But one point I wanted to make was that the estimates have come in line with what we were expecting from high-frequency data. And even in Q1, most analysts who work with high-frequency data had predicted a higher growth than we actually got, than the 5% we actually got. So it suggests that there is a stabilization. All this issue about GDP estimation, is it correctly estimated? Is the economy is actually growing at 4.5? It's not growing at 3% or anything, right? Because the data which the CSO is giving us is in line with high-frequency estimates. So the issue of nominal GDP being so low, I think as a country we have to get used to, we move towards inflation targeting where inflation is to stay in a 2 to 6% range. So we have to get used to lower nominal growth figures, if it's going to be successful inflation targeting. Yeah. And that is the issue where, again, it shows clearly that you had demand decompression, very successful inflation targeting, but not sufficient with an overcorrection, And monetary policy was too tight. The real rate was still high, given the clear sort of, first that, and then second, it was very clear after ILFS that the credit growth is tanking. So credit growth in H1 this year is only 12% of what it was in H1 last year. Then you obviously expect this kind of widespread slowdown. That time there should have been some kind of rescue package for, liquidity provision, which would have allowed NBFC credit growth to continue. We would not have seen this kind of tanking.
So to your mind, ma'am, this issue of rates, liquidity and the flow of credit to the real economy has a greater bearing on what's happening right now as opposed to the other theory or the other narrative, which is that there is a problem of wages and hence consumer demand.
Yeah, because wage growth didn't suddenly happen last year, no? Wage growth has been moderating for quite some time. Real agricultural growth, wage growth really grew rapidly in the period of very high food inflation. Earlier, it had always been sort of flat. Nominal wage growth would grow in line with the inflation, but real wage. So I think there was a sort of reaction because food is a large part of the consumption basket, and also there was a huge lot of money being pumped into rural construction and so on, government money, and so there was a real wage growth. But that has slowed for a long time now as policy was tightened, the fiscal deficit was tightened, and so on. And then why should that wage growth, slow wage growth, suddenly lead to a decrease in consumption last year? But this decrease happened absolutely after the NBFC and this, because banks are already very cautious and risk averse because of the NPA issue and so on.
Sure.
And then NBFC happened last year in 2018 after, so then credit slowed and the liquidity packages that the government prepared were all working through banks who were not willing to lend that much, so they didn't work too well. And that is why, a lender of last resort function is so important because it has to be done quickly. You have to quickly reassure market, or there's accumulative cycles of contraction,
Sure.
As what is just an illiquidity problem becomes insolvency, there are asset sales at distressed values, which affects balance sheet, which affects spending, which affects others. So we've been seeing that cumulative cycle working through the economy.
Sure. Ma'am, two questions. One on the fiscal side. Do you see merit in the argument that the government needs to do more? I say that recognizing that there's been a significant jump up in government spending in this quarter as reflected in the GDP data. But on the flip side, the problem is that if nominal GDP is lower than that 11-12% which was used in the budget, then you have a fiscal problem, just on the basis of data more than anything else.
Right, but this is what you expect, that tax revenue will slow down when growth slows and nominal GDP, also inflation falls. And but then even the FRBM, which is a very stiff, very very conservative report, that also allows. Has an escape clause that if growth fall is more than 3% in one quarter, then fiscal deficit can rise 0.5. And this government is so committed to reining in the deficit and following that path, they have really not stimulated the economy enough because of that. We've had very conservative and tight fiscal as well as monetary policy ever since 2011, I think, after we had the double deficit problem and so on. So I think that they are going to make sure that the increase in the deficit is not more than this 0.5. They're aggressively pursuing privatization, other ways of raising revenue, finding slack in the system, etc. So therefore, I think then what is happening internationally is that the bond market vigilantes have suddenly reversed. Now they're all saying that the central bank stimulus is not adequate, the world is slow, global growth is slowing, and governments can borrow at such low rates. They should borrow and there should be more fiscal spending. The debt which, say, the advanced economies have, US and so on, is many times what our debt. And we have higher, when people say we are still growing at 4.5%, still positive growth, most advanced economies won't grow at even 2 or 3% if they're lucky. So then what happens is the denominator rises, the deficit ratio falls. That is why the government preponing spending and maintaining, especially capital spending or productive spending, is so important. Because we are seeing in the figures that the only thing that's supporting growth really is public administration and so on, right?
Right.
So they can't afford to sort of stop spending over the next quarter in order to meet some artificial fiscal deficit.
So you do think they'll take that escape clause route of 0.5%?
Yeah, but the 0.5 is not a very large increase in the circumstances.
True. Ma'am, one last question on monetary policy. You already alluded to real rates continuing to be high. This is a question to you as an economist. Do you have a sense of what is an appropriate real rate in such a cycle for India? Because, the Reserve Bank of India had some benchmark which they now don't really look at. They looked at during Dr. Rajan's time, but, since then they haven't been giving us that indicator. So it's very tough for the markets to judge, where the floor is on rates, because you don't know what kind of real rates are seen as appropriate.
Yeah, so I like to look at the 1 year ahead treasury bond because it's forward looking, right? So your expected inflation. I think inflation is not going to be more than 4% because core and so on is very low. And the real rate just now works out to about 0.8. While Rajan and so on used to refer to a real rate of 1.25, but that is a steady state. When you have this kind of a slowdown, then real rates need to come down. I also like to look at it in, after the global financial crisis, we had a cut in nominal rates of about 4.75 and real rates were sharply negative. And you had a huge fiscal stimulus, 4%. And this counter-cyclical policy really stimulated growth. Growth shot up from 6.7 to 11%. They didn't even know it was growing that fast because the data was revised later. But today, we don't want that kind of overreaction. And then there was overreaction of over-tightening all these years. So now I think we need a nominal cut of at least 2%. Real rate can be positive, but it should, mean 0.5 is all right in the circumstances.
Okay.
So, because depending on what inflation you're looking at, the real rate is very different. Although headline inflation has gone up, it's probably transient because of food prices, these floods and so on. Core inflation, WPI inflation is 0.5. That means a very high real rate, which is what faces firms. And then also because we have large spreads in our system. So there's an argument that these spreads, etc., are so high, there's very poor monetary transmission. But there's a counter argument that monetary policy should cut more because there's such high spreads so that, the transmission is there. So I think they have to act on the different kinds of term premium, the risk aversion, which is raising spreads in corporate bonds. They can act on all that as well as bank transmission, but they can begin by cutting their repo rate.